Welcome to a new analysis that could change your perspective on the global economic order. The global financial system is experiencing seismic shifts that few are willing to publicly acknowledge. For decades, the US dollar has reigned supreme as the undisputed currency of international trade, global reserves, and oil transactions. This exorbitant privilege has given the United States unprecedented economic power, the ability to finance massive deficits, impose effective economic sanctions, and essentially make the world subsidize its economy. But today, this dollar-centered monetary system faces its most formidable challenge yet. And it doesn't come from a single rival power or internal collapse, but from a strategic coalition of emerging nations known as BRICS. What started as an acronym coined by Goldman Sachs to refer to Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, has transformed into an economic and political bloc with a clear mission: to create an alternative financial system that does not depend on the US dollar. And what's most alarming for Washington, they are making significant progress with the recent expansion of the bloc to include Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. BRICS now represents over 45% of the world's population, approximately 37% of global GDP in terms of purchasing power parity, 60% of the world's natural resource reserves, and a growing percentage of international trade today. We will analyze the 5 most significant strategic moves BRICS is implementing to challenge the dollar's hegemony. These are not mere symbolic gestures or empty threats. They are concrete initiatives that are already reshaping the global economic landscape. Are we witnessing the beginning of the end of the dollar-centered monetary system? The implications are profound, both for the U.S. economy and the global balance of power. Get ready for a detailed analysis that reveals what mainstream Western media often downplays or completely ignores. Let's begin with the 5th most important factor that is undermining the dominance of the US dollar. Number 5. The boom of trade without dollars. For decades, conducting international trade transactions without using the US dollar seemed almost unthinkable. The global financial system was so intertwined with the American currency that even trade between non-American nations was typically settled in dollars. This dominance provided the United States with what French economist Valéry Giscard d'Estaing called an exorbitant privilege: the ability to print dollars to finance trade deficits while the rest of the world accepted these green bills as a store of value. Essentially, the U.S. could export its inflation to other economies. However, BRICS nations have initiated a silent revolution by establishing bilateral and multilateral trade systems that completely bypass the dollar. Recent data reveals the magnitude of this transformation. China-Russia, the vanguard of de-dollarization. The economic partnership between China and Russia has been a pioneer in this trend. Before 2014, approximately 90% of bilateral trade between these countries was conducted in US dollars. After Western sanctions against Russia that year, both nations began actively developing alternatives. By 2023, an astonishing 95% of bilateral trade between China and Russia, valued at over $240 billion annually, was settled in yuan and rubles. This drastic shift not only represents a significant reduction in demand for dollars, but has also set a precedent for other BRICS members. Russian President Vladimir Putin made this clear at the 2023 BRICS summit. Our trade with China has reached historic levels, and we have practically eliminated the dollar from this equation. This is just the beginning. India, seizing the energy opportunity. India, traditionally a closer ally to the West than China or Russia, has taken surprisingly bold steps towards de-dollarization, particularly in the energy sector. When Western sanctions against Russia created an opportunity to obtain discounted oil, India quickly capitalized, increasing its imports of Russian oil from less than 2% of its total needs in 2021 to more than 35% in 2024. What's most significant is not just the volume of these transactions, but the payment method. India established a rupee-ruble mechanism that allowed oil purchases worth $64.5 billion in 2024 without using a single US dollar, India's finance minister, Nirmala Sitharaman, recently commented, "Our trade arrangements are evolving to reflect current geopolitical realities. Diversifying our international payment mechanisms is simply a pragmatic necessity." Brazil-China, revolutionizing agricultural trade. The trade relationship between Brazil and China represents another significant blow to the dollar. As China's primary soybean supplier, Brazil traditionally received dollar payments for these massive shipments, creating a constant demand for the U.S. currency. However, in a historic move in 2023, the two countries signed agreements to facilitate direct trade in Brazilian reais and Chinese yuan. By 2024, these agreements had enabled approximately $15 billion in soybean trade without any dollar involvement. And Brazilian President Lula da Silva has been particularly vocal about this issue. There's no reason why two sovereign nations need a third currency to trade with each other. This dependency on the dollar is a colonial legacy that must end. Effects of BRICS expansion. Recent expansion of BRICS to include Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates has significantly accelerated this trend. These new members bring critical resources, particularly oil, to the bloc and are already actively participating in de-dollarization initiatives. Saudi Arabia, traditionally one of the United States' staunchest allies in the Middle East, has begun exploring commercial settlement mechanisms in local currencies with other BRICS members. Given that Saudi Arabia is the world's largest oil exporter, this development has potentially seismic implications for the dollar's status. Meanwhile, the United Arab Emirates has become a key financial hub facilitating trade between Africa, the Middle East, and Asia using local currencies instead of the dollar. The cumulative impact consolidated statistics reveal the magnitude of this transformation. Intra-BRICS trade conducted in local currencies increased from 28% in 2020 to 43% in 2024. It is estimated that this shift has reduced demand for US dollars by approximately $350 billion annually. BRICS central banks have collectively reduced their holdings of US Treasury bonds by $285 billion since 2021. While these figures may seem abstract, their impact is concrete. Every international transaction that avoids the dollar gradually decreases global demand for the U.S. currency, reducing its value and the geopolitical power it grants Washington. As economist Michael Hudson put it, the dollar's privilege has allowed the U.S. to maintain twin deficits, trade and budget, without facing the consequences that any other nation would. As more global trade bypasses the dollar, that exceptional era will come to an end. Number for the Gold War, historic reserves. While trade de-dollarization represents a significant challenge to the dollar's hegemony, BRICS nations are simultaneously implementing another strategy, one rooted in the oldest fundamentals of money, the massive accumulation of gold. This modern gold rush among BRICS nations is neither a coincidence nor a mere diversification of assets. It represents a deliberate strategy to reduce dependence on the US dollar and potentially lay the groundwork for a new international monetary system. Unprecedented accumulation. Since 2023, BRICS central banks have embarked on an unprecedented gold buying spree in modern history. Collectively, they have acquired over 1,200 metric tons of gold, valued at approximately $75 billion at current prices. This accumulation rate accounts for more than 80% of all global central bank gold purchases. During this period, as a partial result of this sustained demand, the price of gold has surged by approximately 30% since January 2023, reaching nearly $3,000 per ounce by early 2025. The contrast with Western economies is striking. While the U.S. Federal Reserve and the European Central Bank maintain relatively stable gold reserves, BRICS powers are hoarding the precious metal at an aggressive pace. Country by country breakdown. China, the stealth buyer. China has been particularly methodical in its gold accumulation, increasing its official reserves from 1,948 metric tons in 2022 to 2,264 metric tons by early 2025. However, Analysts suspect that China's true gold holdings may be significantly higher. Unlike Western economies, where gold reserves are fully transparent, China updates its official gold figures irregularly and possibly underreports its actual holdings. Some estimates suggest that China could possess over 4,000 metric tons of gold. When undisclosed reserves are included, the governor of the People's Bank of China cryptically remarked in 2024, gold remains an irreplaceable component of sovereign reserve diversification in times of geopolitical uncertainty. Russia, pivoting toward gold Russia's strategy has been even more aggressive. After Western sanctions limited its access to the global financial system in 2014, Russia systematically liquidated its US dollar holdings while stockpiling gold. By 2025, Russia's gold reserves had reached 2,336 metric tons, surpassing China in official terms. Most notably, gold now represents approximately 25% of Russia's total reserves, compared to just 8% in 2014. Russia's single quotes as central bank governor, Elvira Nabiullina, has been blunt about this strategy in a world where sovereign financial assets can be frozen by political decision. Gold provides a security that no paper asset can match. India, returning to tradition. India, historically one of the world's largest gold consumers, has revived its official gold purchases in recent years. Its reserves have grown from approximately 760 metric tons in 2022 to nearly 900 metric tons. By early 2025, the Reserve Bank of India has cited volatility in currency markets and rising geopolitical tensions as justifications for increasing its gold holdings. This strategy also resonates culturally in a country where gold has traditionally been seen as the ultimate store of wealth. Other BRICS members, following suit. New BRICS members are also joining this trend. Saudi Arabia has increased its official gold reserves by 35% since joining the bloc, while the United Arab Emirates has more than doubled its holdings. Even South Africa, traditionally a net gold exporter due to its mining industry, has begun retaining more of its production for national reserves. Strategic implications. Coordinated gold accumulation raises a critical question. Why are BRICS nations so focused on a metal that many Western economists consider a barbarous relic, preparing for a new monetary system? Many analysts believe that BRICS is positioning itself for the eventual launch of an asset-backed currency that could compete with the dollar. Gold, with its millennia-long history as a store of value, would provide credibility to such an initiative. Sergei Glaziev, a Russian economist who heads the Economic Commission of the Eurasian Economic Union, has explicitly proposed a new international trade currency backed by gold and other commodities as an alternative to the dollar. Protection against sanctions. Gold reserves offer a crucial advantage over dollar-denominated assets. They cannot be frozen or confiscated through the digital financial system. After the West froze approximately $300 billion in Russian reserves held in dollars and euros following the invasion of Ukraine, this consideration has gained new urgency for BRICS members. As one Chinese central bank official anonymously put it, gold does not require any country's permission to be valuable. It cannot be canceled by political decision. Market signaling. The consistent accumulation of gold also sends a powerful signal to global financial markets about declining confidence in the US dollar. Every additional gold purchase announcement by a BRICS central bank tends to drive up the metal's price and generate headlines about de-dollarization, creating a virtuous or vicious, from the U.S. perspective, cycle of momentum away from the dollar. Impact on markets. The effects of this gold accumulation strategy are already evident in global financial markets. Gold prices have experienced their most sustained rally in decades, rising more than 50% since 2021. Volatility in U.S. Treasury bond markets has increased as investors reconsider the risks of dollar-denominated assets. Gold ETFs and mining stocks have consistently outperformed broader stock indices, reflecting a shift in investor preference. As Goldman Sachs commodities strategist recently observed, structural demand from central banks is fundamentally recalibrating the gold market. This is not a cyclical phenomenon, but a long-term strategic realignment. Number 3. The Petroyuan, the lethal blow to the petrodollar. If the rise of trade without dollars and the massive accumulation of gold represent significant threats to the US dollar's hegemony, the emergence of the Petroyuan could be the definitive strike. To understand why, we must recall how the dollar became the dominant global currency in the first place. The petrodollar system, the cornerstone of dollar hegemony in 1971. When the United States unilaterally abandoned the gold standard, many predicted the imminent collapse of the dollar. However, the Nixon administration devised a brilliant solution, the petrodollar system, through a series of secret diplomatic agreements completed in 1974. The United States convinced Saudi Arabia and later other OPEC members to sell their oil exclusively in US dollars and reinvest much of those earnings in US Treasury bonds. In return, the US provided military protection to the Gulf monarchies. This arrangement created an artificial yet massive demand for US dollars, as any country wanting to buy oil, essentially all industrialized economies, first needed to acquire dollars. It is estimated that global oil trade generates a demand of approximately $14 trillion in US dollars annually. As Henry Kissinger, then US Secretary of State, famously said, "If you control oil, you control nations. If you control food, you control people. If you control money, you control the entire world." The Petroyuan challenge for decades, this system remained virtually uncontested. Even when producers like Iran and Iraq attempted to sell oil in other currencies, they faced severe consequences. However, in recent years, China has been systematically challenging this paradigm through several mechanisms. The historic agreement with Saudi Arabia's most significant development occurred in December 2024 when Saudi Arabia, newly incorporated into BRICS, announced that it would begin accepting yuan as payment for a portion of its oil exports to China. Although initially modest in scale, approximately 10% of the bilateral oil trade, valued at $65 billion annually, this agreement has profound implications. Saudi Arabia has historically been the most loyal guardian of the petrodollar system, and this move signals a fundamental shift in its geopolitical orientation. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman diplomatically stated, "Diversifying our trade settlement mechanism strengthens our economic resilience in an emerging multipolar world." Shanghai's yuan-denominated oil futureshina launched yuan-denominated oil futures contracts on the Shanghai International Energy Exchange in 2018. Initially dismissed as a niche experiment, these contracts have gained significant traction. By 2024, trading volume had reached 15% of the global oil futures market, surpassing even the most optimistic expectations. Most notably, these contracts are convertible into gold, giving sellers an option to completely bypass the dollar-based financial system. Bilateral agreements with other major producers by in Saudi Arabia. China has established yuan-denominated oil trade agreements with several major producers. Russia now exclusively accepts yuan or rubles for its oil exports to China, approximately 1.85 million barrels per day. Iran, under severe U.S. sanctions, sells all its oil to China in yuan, approximately 700,000 barrels per day. Venezuela has agreed to accept yuan for at least 50% of its oil exports to China. Angola, now Africa's second-largest oil supplier to China, began accepting yuan payments in 2023. The scale of the challenge statistics reveal the magnitude of this transformation. China has surpassed the United States as the world's largest oil importer, purchasing more than 11 million barrels per day. Approximately 30% of these imports, over 3 million barrels per day, are now settled in yuan instead of dollars. If current trends continue, analysts project that more than 50% of China's oil trade could be conducted in yuan by 2026. Translated into monetary terms, this shift represents approximately $600 billion in annual transactions that no longer create demand for the US dollar, a figure that is rapidly growing. Iran, the case study of failed sanctions. Perhaps the most revealing example of the Petroyuan's rise is Iran. Despite facing the most severe US sanctions in history, Designed explicitly to reduce Iran's oil exports to zero, the country continues exporting approximately 1.5 million barrels per day, primarily to China. This trade is conducted entirely outside the dollar system, using yuan, local currencies, and even barter mechanisms. The fact that U.S. sanctions historically, one of Washington's most powerful foreign policy tools, can be bypassed in this manner, signals a fundamental shift in global financial power. As Iran's oil minister stated in 2024, the era in which the United States could dictate who we trade with is over. We have found partners who respect our sovereignty. Implications for the global financial system. The rise of the Petroyuan has implications that extend far beyond the oil market. The decline of U.S. seigniorage privilege of seigniorage, the ability of the United States to finance massive deficits by printing dollars that other countries accept as reserves, depends heavily on the petrodollar system. As this system erodes, so does Washington's ability to maintain twin deficits, trade and budget, without inflationary consequences. The weakening of U.S. economic sanctions, have been a central tool of U.S. foreign policy for decades. However, as more oil trade occurs outside the dollar ecosystem, the United States' ability to weaponize its currency diminishes significantly. Former Dallas Federal Reserve President Richard Fisher warned, excluding adversaries from the dollar-based financial system may provide short-term relief, but it accelerates the search for long-term alternatives, a signal to other economic sectors. Oil, due to its strategic importance and high value, has been the last stronghold of dollar dominance in commodity trade. If this sector can successfully de-dollarize, other commodity markets are likely to follow suit. There are already signs of this trend, with India purchasing Russian gold in rupees, Brazil buying fertilizers in reais, and an increasing amount of industrial metal trade settled in yuan. The U.S. responsive U.S. administration has not ignored these developments. Responses have included diplomatic pressure on Saudi Arabia to maintain the petrodollar system, including warnings about the security of Saudi assets in the United States, efforts to strengthen security alliances with Gulf states in the face of growing Chinese economic influence, consideration of secondary sanctions against entities facilitating oil trade in yuan. However, these responses have been primarily reactive and have not addressed the structural factors driving oil market de-dollarization. As a former U.S. Treasury official commented, "You can't force countries to use your currency if they perceive that the cost of doing so outweighs the benefits." Monetary sovereignty is increasingly seen as an essential component of national sovereignty. Number to the tariff threat, the U.S. strikes back. As BRICS advances with its de-dollarization agenda, the United States has not remained idle. The Trump administration has dusted off one of the oldest tools of economic policy, tariffs. This response, while seemingly straightforward, could have complex and potentially counterproductive consequences for the global economy and the U.S. dollar itself. Trump's tariff offensive. Trump administration's tariff strategy has been unprecedented in modern times. In terms of its breadth and aggressiveness, broad tariffs on traditional allies in a move that surprised even experienced observers. The administration imposed 25% tariffs on imports from Canada and Mexico in early 2025, despite the existence of the USMCA trade agreement, formerly NAFTA. This decision signaled a fundamental shift in U.S. trade policy. Even the closest allies were not exempt from economic pressure. President Trump justified these tariffs by stating, "For too long, our neighbors have enjoyed unilateral access to our markets while protecting their own. That era is over." Specific threats against BRICS. Even more significant have been the explicit threats against BRICS nations. In a statement that sent shockwaves through global markets, the Trump administration threatened to impose 100% tariffs on imports from BRICS countries if they continued with their de-dollarization initiatives. The U.S. Trade Representative was exceptionally direct. Countries seeking to subvert the dollar-based global financial system will face severe economic consequences. We cannot and will not allow the foundation of American prosperity to be undermined. Targeting strategic sectors. Tariff strategy has not been limited to general tariffs. The administration has identified specific sectors where BRICS nations are particularly competitive or dependent on the U.S. market. Chinese technology, including semiconductors and telecommunications equipment, Brazilian agricultural products, particularly soy and meat, Indian pharmaceuticals and IT services, Russian raw materials, especially metals and fertilizers, be targeting these industries. Washington hopes to maximize its leverage and create divisions within the BRICS bloc. The BRICS response, a unified challenge unlike previous trade disputes, where targeted countries often capitulated to U.S. pressure. BRICS nations have presented a surprisingly unified front. Brazil's defiant stance. Brazilian President Lula da Silva, a respected figure in the global south, has been particularly vocal in his resistance. We will not be stopped by threats. Brazil is not a colony of any power, and we will make decisions based on our own national interests, not under coercion. This rhetoric has been backed by concrete actions, with Brazil accelerating efforts to diversify its export markets away from the U.S. and toward other BRICS members, particularly China. China's controlled deglobalization strategy, China, as the largest economy in BRICS, has adopted what analysts call a controlled deglobalization strategy. In response to U.S. tariff threats, systematic reduction of dependence on U.S. markets, accelerated development of indigenous technologies to reduce vulnerabilities to export restrictions, deepening economic ties with other BRICS countries, and global South nations, building alternative financial infrastructure to mitigate the impact of potential sanctions. A senior Chinese economic official stated, "We have carefully studied previous trade wars and developed contingencies for any scenario. The Chinese economy is now large and resilient enough to withstand external pressures." Coordinated BRICS responses, perhaps most concerning for Washington, has been evidence of political coordination among BRICS nations in response to tariff threats. Establishment of a joint $150 billion stabilization fund to support industries and businesses affected by U.S. tariffs. Reciprocal purchase commitments to absorb exports that would otherwise go to the U.S. Acceleration of alternative payment system development to reduce exposure to the U.S.-dominated financial system. Joint diplomatic statements condemning Washington's economic unilateralism. At the early 2025 BRICS summit, leaders issued a joint statement declaring that economic threats and coercion will not deter our determination to create a more equitable and representative international economic system. The inflationary dilemma in the United States. The U.S. tariff strategy faces a fundamental dilemma. While tariffs can inflict economic pain on BRICS nations, they also impose significant costs on the U.S. economy, particularly in the form of inflationary pressures. The impact on consumer prices. Economic data already shows the impact of existing tariffs. U.S. overall inflation accelerated to 4.8% in early 2025. Significantly exceeding the Federal Reserve's 2% target. Prices of imported consumer goods increased by an average of 12.5% year-over-year. The most affected categories include electronics, up 18.7%, furniture, up 15.3%, and clothing, up 10.1%. A recent study by economists from the University of Chicago and UC Berkeley estimated that existing tariffs cost the average American household approximately $2,400 more annually. If 100% tariffs were imposed on all BRICS countries, this cost could more than double. The Federal Reserve's dilemma. This inflationary dynamic places the Federal Reserve in a difficult position. If it responds aggressively to inflation by raising interest rates, it risks triggering an economic recession. If it tolerates higher inflation to protect growth, it could further undermine global confidence in the dollar. In either case, the cost of federal borrowing, already over $1 trillion annually just in interest payments, will increase significantly. As a former Federal Reserve economist observed, tariff policy and monetary policy are working in opposite directions, creating an economic vicious cycle that may be difficult to break. The potential for escalation. Perhaps the greatest risk is the possibility of a spiral of retaliations that could fundamentally destabilize the global economy. If the U.S. imposes 100% tariffs on BRICS, those countries will likely respond with comparable Tariffs. This could trigger a new round of U.S. tariffs, followed by more retaliations. The end result could be significant fragmentation of the global economy into competing trade blocs. Some economic historians are already drawing comparisons to the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930, which imposed record tariffs and is widely considered a contributing factor to the deepening of the Great Depression. The paradox of U.S. tariff policy. Fundamental irony of the U.S. tariff strategy is that it could accelerate precisely the process it is trying to prevent, the de-dollarization of the global economy. By increasing the costs and uncertainty of trading with the United States, tariffs incentivize countries to develop alternative trade channels that will inevitably reduce dependence on the dollar. As an IMF economist succinctly put it, using tariffs to protect the dollar's status is like trying to put out a fire with gasoline. It may appear as a show of strength in the short term, but in the long run, it only intensifies the problem. 1. The Europe factor. Will it betray the U.S.? The most potentially disruptive development in the de-dollarization saga does not come from BRICS nations themselves, but from an unexpected place: Europe. The European Union, traditionally the closest economic and geopolitical ally of the United States, is showing concerning signs of distancing itself from the dollar-centric economic system. This shift could pose the most significant challenge to dollar hegemony, as the EU remains the second largest economy in the world and a central pillar of the Western economic order. The growth of EU BRICS trade without dollars contrary to expectations that Europe would fully align with the United States in response to the BRICS challenge. We have witnessed a steady increase in direct trade between the EU and BRICS nations that bypasses the US dollar. German energy agreements. Germany, Europe's largest economy, has been particularly active in this regard. In a significant development, German industrial giants signed agreements worth $10 billion to import liquefied natural gas (LNG) from Brazil, with transactions settled primarily in euros and Brazilian reais. Germany's economy minister explained, "The decision, diversification, is not just about energy sources, but also about financial mechanisms. Europe must preserve its strategic autonomy in an emerging multipolar world." This agreement follows a broader trend of German companies seeking to reduce their exposure to the dollar, especially after U.S. secondary sanctions affected several European firms conducting business with Iran and Russia. Franco-Indian Technological Cooperation France has established a strategic partnership with India, worth more than $5 billion, focused on solar technology and energy storage. Notably, these agreements specify the euro and the Indian rupee as settlement currencies. The French president commented, "Europe must forge its own path in international relations. Our common currency, the euro, must reflect our collective economic sovereignty." Italy-China expanding trade, which briefly joined China's Belt and Road Initiative before withdrawing under U.S. pressure, has nevertheless maintained a flourishing trade relationship with Beijing. Bilateral trade reached $74 billion in 2024, with approximately 20% now settled directly in euros and yuan. The scale of EU BRICS trade aggregated numbers reveal the magnitude of this trade relationship and its potential to influence the global monetary system. The EU imported approximately $400 billion worth of goods and services from BRICS nations in 2024, a 15% increase from the previous year. About 18% of this trade, $72 billion, is already settled without using the US dollar, up from less than 7% in 2021. Projections suggest that this proportion could reach 30% by 2026 if current trends continue. To put these figures in perspective, the volume of EU BRICS trade that has already abandoned the dollar exceeds the entire trade volume between the US and Japan. This is not a marginal statistic, but a seismic shift in global financial flows. Driving factors behind Europe's distancing. What is driving this apparent European distancing from the US-dominated financial system? Several key factors are at play. The trauma of secondary sanctions. European companies have been disproportionately affected by US secondary sanctions in recent years. Notable cases include BNP Paribas fined $9 billion for violating U.S. sanctions on Iran. Airbus losing multi-billion-dollar contracts due to U.S.-controlled components. Subject to export restrictions. Nord Stream facing sanctions that impacted multiple European firms. These experiences have fueled what EU officials call open strategic autonomy, an effort to reduce vulnerabilities to unilateral U.S. actions. Economic opportunities in BRICS nation-shade demographic and economic reality is inescapable. BRICS markets represent a growing share of global economic expansion. The EU, facing internal demographic challenges and slow growth, increasingly views these emerging economies as essential trade partners. As the EU Trade Commissioner stated, Europe cannot afford to stand on the sidelines. While the global economic map is being redrawn, we must be pragmatic and proactive in our engagement with all major economies. Changing geopolitical considerations and geopolitical dynamics have also influenced Europe's stance. Concerns about U.S. reliability after turbulent political changes, recognition of the necessity for constructive relations with China and other emerging powers. A desire to act as a diplomatic bridge rather than taking sides in a new Cold War. Growing opposition to reciprocal tariffs between the U.S. and the EU. A senior German foreign ministry official confidentially remarked, "In a multipolar world, bloc politics is an outdated approach. Europe cannot simply be a satellite in the U.S. or China's orbit. We must chart our own course." Europe's financial initiatives. Beyond specific trade agreements, Europe has been actively developing financial infrastructure that could facilitate further de-dollarization. Instex, the precursor instrument in support of trade exchanges. Instex was established by the EU in 2019 as a barter mechanism to facilitate trade with Iran despite U.S. sanctions. Though limited in scope, it set a significant precedent, the first time since World War II, that Europe deliberately created financial infrastructure designed to bypass U.S. control. The Euro-BRICS Connect system. Building on Instex's experience, the EU is currently developing a more ambitious system called Euro-BRICS Connect, designed to facilitate direct trade settlements between the euro and BRICS currencies, without passing through the US dollar. Set to be fully operational by 2026. This system could initially handle up to 100 billion euros in annual transactions, with significant capacity for expansion. Renewed euro internationalization. European Central Bank ECB, under its current leadership, has taken a more assertive stance on euro internationalization. Recent initiatives include issuance of 500 billion euros in joint eurobonds to finance post-COVID recovery, discussions on a digital euro with potential for cross-border settlements, expansion of swap lines with non-Western central banks active, promotion of euro usage in energy and commodity contracts. As the ECB president recently stated, a stronger euro on the international stage would benefit Europe and contribute to a more balanced and resilient global monetary system. Washington's reaction. The U.S. administration has observed these trends with growing alarm, implementing a two-pronged strategy in response. Diplomatic pressure. Washington has exerted intense diplomatic pressure on European capitals, arguing that de-dollarization undermines Western unity against common rivals. Behind closed doors, discussions have included direct warnings about implications for security and defense cooperation. A senior U.S. senator recently warned, "Our European allies cannot expect to enjoy the protection of the American security umbrella while simultaneously undermining the economic foundations of our alliance." Economic incentives. At the same time, the U.S. has offered various incentives to keep Europe within the dollar system. Preferential access to dollar financing during market stress episodes. Regulatory flexibility for European financial institutions operating in U.S. markets. Trade concessions in sectors of interest to European exporters. Deeper consultations on future sanctions policy decisions. These measures have had mixed success, with some European countries more receptive than others. Notably, Eastern European nations have generally remained more aligned with the U.S. stance than their Western European counterparts. The bigger picture, betrayal or pragmatic realignment. The fundamental question is whether Europe's actions constitute a betrayal of the transatlantic alliance, as some in Washington suggest, or simply a pragmatic realignment in a changing world? The answer likely lies somewhere in between. European leaders continue to value the U.S. alliance and share many concerns about Chinese and Russian influence. However, they also recognize that European interests are not always identical to those of the U.S., particularly in economic matters. As a veteran EU diplomat put it, friendship does not require dependency. A truly strong U.S. partner must be economically resilient and capable of defending its own interests. This strengthens, rather than weakens, the transatlantic alliance in the long run. However, from the perspective of dollar hegemony, the implications are clear and potentially irreversible. If Europe, with its enormous economic weight and institutional legitimacy, begins to significantly move away from the dollar system, other countries will have far less hesitation in following suit. As a JP Morgan strategist recently noted, the decisive factor in any global monetary transition will not be the actions of China or Russia, which can be dismissed as revisionist, but those of Europe. If the EU seriously starts de-dollarizing, then the game has fundamentally changed. As a veteran diplomat recently concluded, for 7 decades, the international monetary system has been a reflection of American dominance. If that system is fundamentally changing, we should not be surprised that the underlying geopolitical order is also in flux. The coming years will determine whether this transition leads to a new global consensus or an era of accelerated fragmentation. In conclusion, a new emerging monetary order. Through this analysis, we have examined 5 major vectors through which the US dollar is facing unprecedented challenges: trade without dollars among BRICS nations, the massive accumulation of gold by central banks, the rise of the Petroyuan, the U.S. tariff offensive and its counterproductive repercussions, and the potential distancing of Europe from the U.S.-dominated financial system. Individually, each of these factors would represent a significant challenge to dollar hegemony. Collectively, they suggest that we are witnessing the emergence of a new global monetary order, one that will be more multipolar, more complex, and potentially more volatile than the near-monopolistic system that has existed since the end of World War II. What does this mean for the future? It would be premature to predict the imminent collapse of the dollar. As the dominant global reserve currency for more than 70 years, the dollar possesses institutional, network, and inertia advantages that will not erode overnight. The United States remains the largest and most innovative economy in the world, with the deepest and most liquid financial markets. However, the trends we have analyzed suggest several likely conclusions about the future trajectory: a more fragmented monetary system rather than an abrupt transition from a dollar-dominated system to one dominated by another currency such as the yuan. We are more likely to see the emergence of a more fragmented international monetary system. Different regions and trade blocs may gravitate towards different currencies or baskets of currencies for trade and reserves. The dollar will likely remain an important currency, perhaps even the most important, but it will share the stage with the euro, the yuan, and possibly new commodity-backed or digital monetary instruments. Rising costs for the U.S. economy as external demand for the dollar gradually decreases. The United States will face tangible economic consequences, greater difficulty financing fiscal and trade deficits without inflationary pressure as structurally higher interest rates. To attract buyers of U.S. debt, reduced ability to project economic power through sanctions and financial system control, need for painful domestic economic adjustments. After decades of consumption facilitated by the exorbitant privilege, these adjustments do not necessarily doom the United States to economic decline, but they will require significant policy reforms and possibly a fundamental rethinking of fiscal and trade priorities. Volatility in transition markets. The transition from one global monetary system to another has historically been accompanied by periods of considerable financial volatility. There is no reason to expect this time to be any different. Investors, financial institutions, and policymakers will have to navigate an environment characterized by increased volatility in currency markets, potential periods of dysfunction in bond Market significant reallocations of institutional portfolios increased risks of regional or global financial crisis. Preparing for this volatility will require greater diversification, prudent hedging, and possibly new institutional mechanisms for international monetary coordination. A rebalanced global economy in the long term, however, a more multipolar monetary system could offer substantial benefits for the global economy. Reduction of the global imbalances that have contributed to past financial crises, more equitable distribution of seigniorage benefits among major economies, greater representation of emerging economies in global financial governance, a potently greater systemic stability through diversification, although with more short-term volatility. As economist Barry Eichengreen, one of the leading scholars of international monetary systems, noted, history suggests that international monetary systems can accommodate multiple global currencies. In fact, such systems may be more stable and equitable than those dominated by a single currency. A final reflection: the hegemony of the US dollar has been a defining pillar of the international economic order for the lifetime of most people alive today. Its potential erosion represents a tectonic shift with implications that go far beyond financial markets. As history has shown, transitions in global monetary power often reflect and amplify broader changes in geopolitical balance. The BRICS challenge to the dollar is not merely a technical financial issue, but a manifestation of a fundamental reordering of global power from the West towards a more multipolar system. Whether this reordering can occur peacefully and lead to a more equitable and stable international system, or whether it will be accompanied by intensified economic and geopolitical conflicts, remains perhaps the most consequential question facing the global economy today.